As with its predecessor, Assassin's Creed Valhalla is a sprawling RPG experience. And after a good chunk of time with the game, I discovered more than a few things I wish I had known at the outset. And that's what I'm going to share in this video. Whether you're just digging in or even if you've spent some hours with the game, I hope you'll join me as I share 14 essential tips to help you get the most out of this massive world. I want to thank Ubisoft for sending me a copy of the game, and with that out of the way, let's get into it. If you're like me, you don't want to leave a big area of a game behind if you don't have the option to come back later. And that was my concern with Norway. But fear not, once you arrive in England, the game lets you fast travel back to the frigid north at any time. Just select this option here in the world menu and you're good to go. A huge new part of the gameplay loop in Valhalla is your settlement, but it can be hard to know exactly what buildings to spend your resources on because the game doesn't really tell you what they do, at least not in full. Here's what I wish I had known from the get-go. In addition to the blacksmith, both the stable and the Hidden Ones Bureau are worth building right away. The stable lets you train your mount so it can swim, and you can upgrade its stamina and health. You can also get new mounts like this giant wolf, and you can buy new skins for your raven. As for the Hidden Ones Bureau, this building unlocks your iconic Leap of Faith, and it opens up a quest where you can reveal the history of the assassins by tracking down codex pages. It's also here where you can gain access to the hit list of members of the Order of the Ancients, which is similar to the hit list for the Cult of Kosmos in Assassin's Creed Odyssey. Some other useful additions to the settlement are the Hunter's Hut, where you can trade in animal parts for useful items, and who has a checklist that fills in as you find the game's legendary animals. Then there's the Fishing Hut, which is where you unlock the ability to fish. If cosmetics are your thing, the Tattoo Parlor lets you customize Eivor's appearance, and the museum lets you unlock more decorations for the settlement itself. That said, I do wish I had waited a bit longer to build these two particular buildings. Finally, one of the most useful additions which becomes available a bit later is the Cartographer, who can mark the location of gear, resources, and new abilities on your map. One final note on building your settlement is that in your bedroom you'll find a podium on which you'll find a list of buildings the game recommends that you build at any given point, which is actually pretty handy. It's tempting to just pick one weapon and stick with it, but different weapons in Valhalla really do affect how you engage in combat. Like, a lot. I started with an axe and a shield, which I liked because it provided the combo of both offense and defense. But it wasn't until I tried using both a flail and an axe that I really found my groove. Seriously, hold the flail in your right hand and you can just tear through enemy shields. And with an axe in your left hand, you can unleash a brutal one-handed hackathon. But I didn't stop there. I soon equipped a spear, which is currently my favorite weapon in the game. It deals decent damage, and its length let me keep my distance from tougher enemies like bosses and legendary animals. Surely there are other weapons that'll match your playstyle, but you might never find them if you don't experiment. Learning the basics of the new stun system is essential if you want to succeed in combat. Here's how it works. Every enemy has a stun meter right above their health meter. When this meter is depleted, your enemy becomes vulnerable to a stun attack, and then you can press the right analog stick to pull off a brutal instant kill. So, how do you deplete the stun meter? Well, you can land heavy attacks, but the more effective way, at least for me, was to parry. Parries are more challenging in Valhalla than in Odyssey, but it pays to learn the timing. There's also another way to stun your foes. You might have noticed that some enemies have these glowing gold areas. These are weak points, and if you hit an enemy with an arrow in each of their weak points, they become vulnerable to a stun attack. However you stun a foe, killing enemies with stun attacks, at least for me, was hands down the quickest way to clear a crowded battlefield. Valhalla lets you equip special combat abilities that you discover by finding books of knowledge throughout the world. Like Odyssey, you can actually equip up to 8 at any given time, but to be honest, I found many of the early combat abilities to be, well, a little underwhelming. But then I unlocked Dive of the Valkyries, easily the best ability I found in the early game. It lets you leap into the air and then rain down a burst of serious unblockable damage on your opponent, and it even works from a pretty good distance. Unfortunately, I didn't record exactly on the map where I found the book of knowledge that unlocks Dive of the Valkyries, so I can't point it out for you, but when you do find it, I'd equip it immediately. Speaking of abilities, I found one that you actually get via an optional side quest rather than from a book of knowledge, and it's pretty cool. In your longhouse back at your settlement, you'll eventually see this kid asking for your help. Now, this was totally optional, but when I agreed, he led me on a quest where I rescued a captured wolf. My reward? A special ability called Man's Best Friend that allows me to sick that very same wolf onto an enemy. If you get the hang of it, this can be a major help in combat. Valhalla introduces an entirely new upgrade system for both weapons and armor, and it can be a little confusing at first, but here are the basics. You can now improve your gear in 2 ways. The first is called, well, upgrading, and it's done directly from your inventory menu. Each time you upgrade a piece of gear, you'll fill in one of its upgrade slots, which boosts the individual stats of that piece of gear. Basically, this is how you make a piece of gear more powerful. But what happens when you fill in all of an item's upgrade slots? That's where the second type of upgrade comes in, called enhancing. This can be done at your blacksmith back at your settlement, and each time you enhance a piece of gear, you add upgrade slots to that piece of gear, and often you'll also add a rune slot. Runes are items that you find in the world that add additional stat boosts to your gear. Basically, all you need to know is that upgrading increases the stats of gear, while enhancing adds to the number of times you can upgrade and to the number of runes you can equip. Raiding is a big part of gameplay in Assassin's Creed Valhalla, but there are a few things to keep in mind before you get started. First, you can raid any riverside military encampment, and there are quite a few. But if you want to find raw materials, which are required to upgrade your settlement, you'll need to raid locations marked on your map with these red icons. Also, note the level gating. I made the mistake of raiding a monastery early on with a recommended power level of 160, and I got destroyed. Also, when you get into a raid, I found it helpful to frequently use Odin's Sight. Raids can get somewhat crowded, and this will highlight in bright red which fighters are your enemies, as opposed to members of your own crew. Oh, and one last thing, the game shows you how to trigger a raid from your boat, but you can also hail your crew from land. Just open the game's ability wheel and blow your horn. One helpful menu in the game that's really easy to overlook is Eivor's stats menu, which tracks the power level for each individual stat. Most useful to me is that by hovering your cursor over each stat, you can see exactly what it does. Now, you might be asking, why is this important? Well, once you dig into the skill tree, you'll see some skill nodes will boost individual stats, and while most of these are self-explanatory, some are pretty vague. For example, I had to look up evasion, elite damage, and weight to figure out just what they did. So if you want to know what a stat does before you spend a skill point, you can find out right here. So on your stat menu, you'll notice your charisma stat, which is built by completing fighting challenges against NPCs. These are the Viking rap battles that test your rhyming skills. Should you win, you'll be rewarded with some coin and you'll boost your charisma stat. So what does that do? It actually opens up new dialogue options in certain conversations. In one example, when someone requested a fee for providing some information, I was given the option to talk them down by half. Not too shabby. The skill tree in Assassin's Creed Valhalla is massive. It features a ton of stat boosts and passive abilities, and yes, these are different from the abilities I looked at earlier. Also, this skill tree is actually 3 skill trees in one. The red or bear skill tree is focused on close-quartered melee combat. The yellow or raven skill tree is geared towards stealth and ranged combat, while the blue or wolf skill tree, from what I found, lands somewhere in between. Now, it might be tempting to focus all your skill points onto one type of build, but I found valuable skills within all 3 skill trees. Here are just some that I found very helpful in the early game. In the bear skill tree, there's the stomp skill, which lets you stomp enemies that have been knocked to the ground, and the parry damage skill, which deals damage to opponents anytime you parry their attack. In the wolf skill tree, I found use for the emergency aim skill, which lets you instantly target an enemy with your bow once they detect you. And in the raven skill tree, I was glad to have unlocked advanced assassination, which lets you assassinate enemies that are more powerful than you. Guided arrow, which lets you adjust an arrow's trajectory mid-flight, assuming you have a predator bow. Chain assassination, which lets you assassinate 2 nearby enemies at once. And brush with death, which slows down time whenever you perform a perfect dodge. Now, as I've said, the skill tree is massive, so there are plenty of skills that I haven't yet had a chance to experiment with, but those were some of the skills that worked for me. Also, you can undo any skill point you spend, so don't worry about unlocking the wrong skill node or committing to the wrong skill tree. Assassin's Creed Valhalla has more enemy types than any AC game before. A lot more. And they're all listed in the game's codex. More than that, each entry provides some simple but honestly pretty helpful combat tips. For example, once I learned that a spearman's defensive stance could be broken by landing one heavy attack, fighting them became much easier. And when I found this guy called a firekeeper, he nearly took me out. So I opened my codex and found that you can actually use their explosive attack against them if your timing is right. Granted, this tactic is easier said than done, but nonetheless, I wouldn't have known about it had I not opened my codex. In Assassin's Creed Valhalla, social stealth is back. Basically, you'll occasionally enter what are called distrust areas, which are patrolled, but unlike full-on restricted areas, wearing your hood in a distrust area will allow you to stay anonymous. That said, it's still pretty easy to get spotted, even if you are wearing your hood, and as such, you'll have several ways to stay hidden. One is to find a group of monks and blend in. Another is to find a table or a bench that prompts you to basically fake certain activities. But those are the obvious options. You can also hail a town drunk. Get one to follow you, and then you can prompt him at any time to cause a scene and distract any nearby guards. You can also use the Raven Distraction ability, which will summon your Raven from above to, well, distract an enemy. This worked like a charm when there was only one guard to sneak past. And remember that man's best friend ability that I mentioned earlier? That can be another great way to stealthily deal with guards, although calling this social stealth might be a bit of a stretch. In Assassin's Creed Valhalla, there are 3 different types of bows, and they're vastly different from one another. Hunter bows are basic and balanced. Nothing special here. But light bows let you shoot rapid-fire arrows one after another just by holding down the trigger. This can really help if you're trying to hit an enemy's weak spots. If you do take a liking to the light bow, I also recommend upgrading your quiver so that you can carry more arrows. And then there are predator bows, which you'll need if you want to take advantage of the guided arrow ability I mentioned earlier. Problem is, weapons and honestly all gear is much more rare in Valhalla than in Odyssey, so you might have to wait a while before you find a bow of each type. So there you have it. I hope you found this video informative and maybe even fun to watch. If you did enjoy it, don't forget to drop a like and share it with friends. And heck, maybe even subscribe to the channel. If you want to keep up with me and see what I'm playing, you can follow me on Twitter and Instagram at Quest Mode Games. Until next time, I want to remind everyone to never stop questing.